Outpost Vaegr, named for the Old Norse word for strength, were used to such harshness. They were all sons and daughters of the North, descendants of seafarers and storytellers who had braved even harsher landscapes centuries ago. For the men and women of Vaegr, mining was more than a job. It was a legacy, another way to wrest treasures from the frozen earth as their ancestors had once wrested survival from the sea. Yet, beneath the camaraderie of their shared heritage, there lingered unease. Steel yourself against the cold. Stoves laid in the corner of each cabin and remained lit throughout the frigid nights, which barely prevented the frost from building. Workers slept in layers, woolen undershirts and thick socks doubling as both pajamas and the base layer for the day's work. Air was sharp, dry and bracing, making breaths feel like inhaling ice shards. On the skin, it was razors tipped with glass, deep and sharp with every breath. The sun. It never truly rose in the winter months. Instead, a faint, gray twilight painted the snow-woven landscape in timbres of shadow and frost. Sharpness greeted the miners before they even stepped outside their homes, seeping through the walls of the clapboard structures and biting at exposed skin like an ever-present predator. Inside the small, dimly lit cabins, the miners stirred awake to the sound of the communal bell tolling from the outposts, the mess hall. A slow, heavy clang that carried through the frost-choked air. A hunched man wrapped in furs sat in his usual spot by the long house's hearth. A carved staff resting against his knee. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, eyes pale yet piercing, as though he could see the woven tapestry of fate tangled around each worker. Before setting out, it was customary for the workers to pay their respects to Lintel, the village elder. "Back to the sinkholes today," one of the miners said, their voice tinged with unease. Lintel nodded slowly, his fingers brushing the carved runes etched into his staff. "The Helgroth watches," he murmured, his voice a low rasp that demanded attention. "Take care, for it is not their time to wake." The locals called the sinkholes Helgroth, Hell's Graves. The word carried weight, an unspoken warning, though no one dared to voice it aloud. The miners exchanged uneasy glances. None of them fully believed the elder's warnings, at least not outwardly. His words had a way of settling in the mind, nagging at the edges of thought like a splinter. "Yeah," the medic lingered a moment longer. "Not their time to wake?" she asked quietly. The elder's gaze bore into hers, his expression grim. "You cannot fight them, only respect them, and hope they find you worthy." With that, he turned his attention back to the fire, leaving Ija and the others to ready themselves for the day ahead. The cold seemed sharper than usual, as Wachian made his way through the narrow, snowy path to his family's house. He had forgotten his father's lantern, a tool that, while outdated, had always given him a sense of reassurance when descending into the sinkhole. It wasn't unusual for miners to go back for forgotten gear, but the walk back alone always felt longer than it should. Reaching his cabin, Washin pushed the door open and was immediately greeted by the warmth of the small wood stove crackling in the corner. Setting his gloves down on the table, the first inhale smelling faintly of pine and smoke, as though the past lingered here more strongly than anywhere else in the house. Wooden shelves carved by his grandfather lined the walls and displayed objects that had been in the family for generations. The dim light from the high window illuminated just enough to cast soft shadows over the treasures. An iron-framed lantern rested on a low shelf, polished but well-worn, its glass stained amber from years of use. His father had carried it on his long shifts, claiming it was lucky. Wasian ran his hand over the iron lantern, its smooth metal cool against his palm. He paused for a moment, glancing toward the old slate engraving. Propped on the shelf beside the lantern was a small piece of slate, engraved with angular Nordic runes. His grandmother had always said it was a piece of Fretestein, a foretelling stone meant to guard against poor omens. Above the shelf hung a harpoon, its wood handle splintered with age, and its head rusted but still sharp. It had belonged to his great-grandfather, a sealer who braved the icy fjords. He had always called it Havdirsniv, the sea beast's knife. Sometimes he wondered if his own life would leave anything worth adding to the shelves, or if his family's legacy would end here, in the shadow of Vaegr's mines. Breaking his meandering thoughts, A voice boomed from the main room, rough and biting. Weiqian! Hoping to avoid his father's detection. He braced himself. What are you doing in there? Wasting time staring at ghosts? Weiqian exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the lantern's handle. Just grabbing something I need, he called back, keeping his voice as even as he could manage. Then move faster. You've got work to do, Lars barked, the sound of his heavy boots creaking on the wooden floor growing louder. Weiqian turned toward the doorway just as his father appeared, towering and broad-shouldered even in the dim light. Lars's gray hair hung in unruly strands around a face weathered like driftwood, lined with age, but harder than the Arctic wind. I don't have time to stand around and babysit you, Lars growled, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. You think you'll survive the sinkholes with your head in the clouds, dreaming about useless trinkets like that? He gestured roughly toward the shelves. They're not useless, Weiqian said quietly, his voice firm despite his father's glare. They're part of who we are. You kept them for a reason, didn't you? Lars snorted. I keep them because your mother did. Don't think for a second that staring at them will make you stronger. Out there, the only thing that keeps you alive is your wits and your back. Weiqian clenched his jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. He had long since learned that arguing with his father was like shouting into a blizzard. He grabbed the lantern and tucked the runestone into his pocket. I'm going, he said, brushing past Lars toward the door. As he reached the threshold, Lars's voice cut through the air like a knife. Don't lose yourself out there, boy. The land doesn't care about you, and it sure as hell won't give you a second chance. Weiqian paused, his hand on the doorframe. He didn't look back. I know, he said simply, stepping out into the cold. The door closed behind him, muting the warmth and the tension of the house. Weiqian exhaled, watching his breath bloom into the frigid air before fading away. His father's words echoed in his mind, though not for the reasons Lars might have hoped. He looked back at the small cabin, its windows faintly glowing against the gray sky. For all his father's harshness, the man had never taken the relics down, never sold them, never tossed them aside. Deep down, Weiqian wondered if Lars feared the same things he did. The land, the stories, the weight of history pressing down like the cold. Lantern in hand, Weiqian began the walk back to the sinkholes. Wind had picked up, stirring the snow into faint eddies that danced across the ground. Vager's landscape stretched out before him, endless white, broken only by the dark ridges of the distant mountains and the jagged edge of the sinkhole looming on the horizon. The crew was already gathering near the equipment sheds, their forms little more than silhouettes in the faint light. Weiqian adjusted his scarf and started back toward the group, the lantern clinking softly at his side. Walking back felt less lonely this time, though he couldn't quite shake the sense that the land itself was watching. It was a foolish thought, he told himself. The sinkhole was just a hole. These relics were just objects. And yet, the weight in his pocket reminded him that his family had once believed otherwise. And maybe, in some small way, he still did too. At this stage, the sinkholes appeared deceptively lifeless. The jagged edges of the largest pit loomed ahead, carved by frost and erosion. Mist clung to the ground like a veil, obscuring the depths, and the distant howling wind seemed almost like a warning. Still, something felt off. Ija, walking at the rear of the group, paused to glance over her shoulder. A faint vibration hummed through her boots. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to make her frown. She dismissed it as the distant rumble of machinery, but couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. The others were quiet, their focus entirely on the task ahead. The air was heavy, not just with cold, but with a subtle pressure that none of them could articulate. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. When they reached the sinkhole, the mist cleared just enough to reveal the first signs of something unusual. Faint, branching patterns etched into the ice at the edges of the hole. They looked almost organic, like veins or roots frozen in place. "What's that?" asked Leif, crouching to inspect the markings. "Just ice fractals," Anders muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Fractals don't glow," Freya said, her voice low. She pointed at the faint green shimmer coursing through the patterns, like bioluminescence trapped in the ice. The group exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. After all, it was their job.